Joining us now for our weekly partnership segment is David Sirota of the Daily Poster. Great to see you, David.
Good to see you, David.
Good to see both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a very timely piece out right now. Let's go ahead and throw this up on the screen. Talking about how Biden's Ukraine plans face a Wall Street roadblock and how corporate lobbyists have made it more difficult to levy sanctions directly on the sort of financial elite, so the sort of targeted sanctions that would hit just the oligarchs and not cause insane pain and misery for the entire Russian population. Can you just take us through this piece, David?
Sure. So for years, law enforcement agencies, financial regulators have said that the U.S. and U.K. Financial systems are incredibly opaque, not requiring the kind of basic disclosure that other industrialized nations require. And that has allowed, effectively, oligarchs really from all over the world to make investments in assets, yachts, planes, also ownership assets in private funds like private equity, hedge funds, to make those investments, own those investments, make money off of those investments without allowing law enforcement, regulators, and the general public to know who actually owns those things. And in 2020, the FBI actually issued an alert saying this has become a problem specifically for sanctions evasions, that oligarchs were using potentially the opacity of the U.S. financial system to essentially get around sanctions. And here's the thing, is that corporate lobbyists have obviously been pushing to keep the financial system opaque. Wall Street lobbyists, bank lobbyists, but also other forms of corporate lobbyists have been arguing to financial regulators to not do the kinds of things that would bring these investments out into the open. And of course, that becomes a problem when the United States is considering sanctions on Vladimir Putin's personal assets, Russian oligarchs' assets, that they have a problem being able to even track down those assets for the purposes of sanctioning them. In other words, they have a problem sanctioning Russian oligarchs, Putin's network, because Wall Street has been so successful in keeping the U.S. financial system opaque and in convincing lawmakers to not do what can be done to bring those investments into the sunlight.
Yeah, I think it's important that people understand that. I was thinking the same thing. You know, just during the sanctions when they were announced, I saw that Russian bonds went to zero and a huge amount of banks, David, actually had to do a margin call because a lot of them have been borrowing using bonds as assets. Can you go into that piece, just how dependent Wall Street is on so much of Russian cash?
Look, there was one estimate by Gabriel Zuckman that about more than half of Russian, of the top 1%, top 0.01% of Russia's elite have its assets offshore. Half of those assets are offshore. The U.S. and Britain are known to be the financial systems with the most opacity, among others. I mean, there's smaller countries that are known as tax havens and the like, but in terms of industrialized countries. And here's the thing. Joe Biden has the power right now to start combating this problem. I mean, there is a rule that the Obama administration had proposed to essentially use the Bank Secrecy Act and subject the private funds industry to that 50-plus-year-old law. Biden has not done that. Of course, the financial industry doesn't want him to do that. There was also the Corporate Transparency Act, a bill that did pass last year. And that's a good thing. But in the process of pushing that bill forward, and it was a bipartisan bill, various corporate lobbyists, various corporate industries got exemptions to that bill. That bill was designed to make sure that shell companies would have to at least tell regulators, law enforcement officials, who the actual owners of shell companies are. I mean, think about that. We're in a situation now, we've been in a situation where shell companies don't even have to tell law enforcement agencies who necessarily owns those companies and where that money flows to. And here's the other thing, is that now that law is on the books, they've been pushing forward rules to essentially implement that law. And even in the lead up to the crisis in Ukraine, corporate lobbyists have been pushing to add even more exemptions to the Corporate Transparency Act, trying to water it down. And again, it goes back to the idea that sanctions can be great. They can sound great on paper. We're going to go after the oligarchs. But if you don't give regulators the basic tools to even know who owns shell companies, to know who is invested in the vast world of private equity and hedge funds, then the oligarchs have plenty of ways to get around those sanctions.
That's well said.
What was the impetus for these rules? Was this to crack down on money laundering, and just talk about that piece of it?
Yes, I mean, that's really what it's been about, is that there's been rising concerns about money laundering. That was the FBI's warning in 2020, that essentially that the U.S. financial system had become a way for all sorts of money laundering, organized crime and the like, to launder money through private funds because the system is so opaque. So it's good. Listen, it's good that the Corporate Transparency Act passed last year. That's good. But as we all know, the devil is in the details. And so when you look at the filings, when you look at these Wall Street trade associations asking for watered down rules, give us an exemption over here, exempt our industry over there, what you see is that Wall Street it has its own interests. And ultimately, what you see is that Wall Street's power over the U.S. financial system and over American politics creates real national security vulnerabilities. I think that is really the key here, is that Wall Street has so much power to buy lawmakers and to buy policy, that ultimately what ends up happening is that the policy ends up being so weak that law enforcement and national security agencies can't do the very basics of their jobs.
Well, and as you're saying, this is just one facet of the national security issues that Wall Street has created for us. You could also talk about, the way that oil interests have kept us from moving aggressively into renewables. So that makes us vulnerable when we have a crisis like this. You could talk about the way that Wall Street and corporate pressures pushed so many of our jobs and our manufacturing overseas so that we don't have our own native capacity, so that when, pandemic hits, we don't have our own PPE. We're dependent on overseas providers. So this is like one really important prism of what is a massive and significant problem for
And I want to add
US
one very
economy.
quick thing. One very quick thing here is that we're talking about the difference between being able to sanction in a targeted way the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin, in contrast to broad sanctions that can hurt the entire Russian population.
That's right.
So I want to be clear. I'm not saying all sanctions are good, but what I am saying is that if you're interested in sanctions that are as narrowly targeted as possible to the most powerful people creating this crisis, then that's what we're talking about here. So we have, in effect, United States regulators have less power than they could have to do that kind of targeted sanctions because of Wall Street's power.
Yeah, so they've sort of taken the scalpel away and left us only with blunt instruments that
Exactly.
are going to impact all of the millions of Russians.
Exactly.
David, always appreciate your reporting. Guys, go subscribe if you can to the Daily Poster. Soon to be are we going with lever or lever?
The lever.
The lever.
The lever.
They are always doing invaluable work to help us understand what is really going on here in Washington and around the world. David, great to see you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks to both of you.
Our pleasure. And thank you guys for watching. We're going to have more for you later. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.